Well, like I said in my review of the first movie, since we got so many of these sequels, people really were screaming for more. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and another installment in my Scream review series where I talk all the Scream movies in the lead up to my review of the new film. And today we're talking about Scream 4. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on this movie were, if you already saw it or if you were planning on seeing it, and make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my content out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time, and let's talk about Scream 4. This takes place on the 15th anniversary of the original Woodsboro killings, where Sidney Prescott, once again played by Neve Campbell, has put herself back together thanks in part to her writing, but soon she's visited by the Ghostface Killer. So as I've done with my reviews of all these other films, this will get into spoilers. So if you haven't seen Scream 4 by now and you wish to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Go watch the movie, then come back to this. But anyway, here we go. Once again written by Kevin Williamson and directed by Wes Craven, this was made at an interesting time in the film industry, and it's weird to say this was already 11 years ago, as I still remember this like it was yesterday. This was made at the initial height when we saw a lot of reboots, remakes, and even more sequels getting off the ground. Like, you know how so many people wrongly like to go around and say there aren't any more original movies out there and it's nothing but sequels and remakes? Well, this was arguably around the time people were starting to say that, at least from what I remember. And this was attempting to do what the new movie's also looking to do as well. It once again brings back our legacy characters, here being Sidney, Gale, and Dewey, the latter two of course being played by Courtney and David Arquette, and since they're now considerably older, this also introduces younger characters who are meant to be a bit more of the focus, while the other three act as mentor figures. Now, the legacy characters aren't placed in quite as heavy of supporting roles as, say, the new Star Wars trilogy. This isn't quite as much of a pass the torch movie because I'd say Sidney, Gale, and Dewey had consistently prominent roles in the film right from the get-go, and we do see them quite a lot. Maybe it's just a little less than the original three movies, but they're in there quite a lot. But the idea was that they were something of mentors to these newer characters. And because of that structure, the interesting thing about this is, even though this is called Scream 4 and you clearly have to watch the other movies first, the main trend this was particularly satirizing was remakes, even though this itself isn't a remake. I mean, it does take place again in Woodsboro for the first time since the first, and the idea revolves around someone recreating the murders in those films, so in a way it channels some of those same notions of a remake, but this definitely isn't a remake itself. But interesting note, the idea behind this was initially to kick off a new trilogy of movies that would once again be both written by Kevin Williamson and directed by Wes Craven. Unfortunately, this underperformed at the box office, and that led to these sequels getting scrapped. And unfortunately, this makes not only the last Scream film directed by Wes Craven, but the last movie directed by Wes Craven, period, as he passed away in 2015. But I'd say this was a solid final film to go out on. I feel like because this came and went at the box office so quickly, and while considerably more positively reviewed than 3, it still received somewhat mixed reception, this one's probably the most underappreciated of the Scream movies. I've heard quite a few people say it's not all that good, and that's down there with Scream 3, but while it's not my absolute favorite of the Scream movies, I think this one's mostly a fun time, and I find it to be great for a number of reasons. If anything, it was a little ahead of its time since this did the older characters mentoring the newer characters first before Star Wars really made that popular. While it definitely goes back to the more violent nature of the first two movies, after the third movie kind of toned that down a bit, this also continues something the third movie was doing and cranks up the comedy. Scream has always bordered on horror comedy territory, with some people even classifying them as such, and while I don't completely agree that they are, though I can see why, I'd say this is probably the closest to straight up horror comedy we've gotten in the franchise. After Williamson's absence in the third movie, we go back to the very snappy dialogue that was a major part of the first two movies. The characters feel like they fire off quips even more than they did in any of the other movies, and this takes things to a whole new level of meta, especially as we see in the opening sequence, which goes through 3 sets of characters. The initial 2 we follow are Lucy Hale and Sinead Grimes getting killed by Ghostface, which is revealed to be footage of Stab 6, the movie within a movie, and then it cuts to Kristen Bell and Anna Paquin as 2 people watching Stab 6 and arguing over the whole idea of sequels and remakes, which ends with Bell stabbing Paquin, which itself is then revealed to actually be Stab 7 footage. And then finally, we get the real opening of Britt Robertson and Amy Teagarden, who are the actual Woodsboro characters in this main universe killed by Ghostface. So we get a movie within a movie within a movie.
A donut hole hole in a donut's hole.
But I thought this was a great return to form for the now trademark opening scene this series is known for. After something that felt a bit generic in the third movie, this goes back to the creative flair that's prominent in the series, while still keeping with a franchise tradition, and it sets the tone nicely for the rest of the film. This one has a mostly solid balance of thrills and laughs. I'd argue, like the other movies, I never really found it to be scary outside of some jump scares, but it's fun. It's great catching up with Sidney, Dewey, and Gale and seeing some of the shifting dynamics among them. It's fun seeing them interact with a whole new set of characters who approach this stuff just a bit differently. And when we get into the Ghostface chase sequences, it's a blast. Once again, there's a lot of creativity when it comes to how Ghostface attacks, and I like how they find different ways to still make the character work, despite this especially taking place at a time during an increase in technology. Which is one of those things people get worried about when certain franchises keep getting revived, like this and Home Alone. Which, come to think of it, is the only time I'd ever have to mention these two franchises in the same sentence. But since the original film took place at a time before cell phones were widely used, or there were things like caller ID, you do worry how Ghostface can still sneak around and call people without getting caught. But they still find a way to make it work. And the one thing that this especially leans into is the rise of social media, with Ghostface this time even filming the murders to make a snuff film. It doesn't always consistently play with this idea, but it kind of builds on something that we saw in Scream 2 regarding gaining fame due to the media's obsession with violence. And here it especially touches upon that again, but in regards to influencer culture and the way social media especially makes a star out of so many more people than ever before. And once again, we get a lot of fun, creative sequences whenever Ghostface shows up. Probably the two best ones involve Ghostface taunting one of the new characters, Kirby, played by Hayden Panettiere, over the phone, telling her he's in the closet, only to reveal he's in the closet of her friend in the house next door. And the other one involves when he goes after two cops keeping watch over the same house, played by Anthony Anderson and Adam Brody. Mainly because that one's the most openly comedic in nature and one of the most self-referential of the Ghostface sequences, with Anderson's character making a quip right to his last breath. And speaking of cast members, this has probably one of the largest casts of notable names in all the movies. I mean, that was something always consistent with these films, where a few familiar faces would pop up in cameos and bit parts, like Henry Winkler in the first movie, or Heather Graham, Tori Spelling, and Luke Wilson in the second, or Carrie Fisher in the third. But this one is like jam-packed with a notable name in nearly every role. Some were younger actors who were big in teen dramas at the time, some were comedians, but this felt more like a who's who of popular names at the time, inhabiting nearly every role, from the countless people popping up in the opening scene, to all the newer characters working with Sidney, Dewey, and Gale, and then down to some of the bit parts. Though my favorite of the newer characters is the aforementioned Hayden Panettiere as Kirby, who was the fan favorite among pretty much everyone. Now, she's not the Randy of the new group, which would actually be Robbie, played by Eric Knudsen, and to an extent another character named Charlie, played by Rory Culkin, who both run a film club. But she does offer a lot of the comedic relief here, snapping back at other characters and bringing some much needed, lighthearted energy to cut through some of the tension. Every time she was on screen, she was a blast, and of all the supporting characters introduced after the first movie, she was probably my favorite, as I'm sure is the case for a lot of other longtime fans of the series. But of course, one of the other big reasons we come back to these movies is for the legacy characters, and once again, Neve Campbell, David Arquette, and Courtney Cox are all solid. While all three are prominent, I'd say it's a dynamic that's slightly similar to the third movie, where Sidney feels mostly like a supporting character for part of it, while Dewey and Gale are a little more consistently active in the case from the start, with Dewey now being the sheriff. Sidney's role is definitely much bigger here than in 3 though. Like, we don't totally forget about her for like one stretch of the movie like there. But while all three get plenty to do, I'd still say Dewey and Gale have a little more to do here than Sidney, at least at first, even if this time around they're not the primary focus, considering the slight shift to the newer characters. But like I've said in my review of 3, I think their characterizations have got considerably better with each film. I never fully bought into how they hit things off in the first movie, but by here I like the dynamic more, with both of them feeling like they progressed considerably from their characterizations in the first few movies. And even this time around, I actually have come to enjoy Gale, who I found to be completely unlikable for especially the first 2 movies. But here she's quite the opposite, though she still has a little bit of that same fiery energy that bigger fans have especially enjoyed about her, especially as she butts heads with Dewey's deputy, Judy, played by Marley Shelton. And Neve Campbell is once again fantastic. She's always been one of the most endearing parts of these movies, and she gets to play the role with a little bit more badassery thrown in there, as she has a little bit of this over-it attitude compared to the other films, films and will cut right to the chase if someone rubs her the wrong way. So it allows her to really just navigate through each scene with even more of a commanding presence than usual, and it's just a nice progression of the character. And once again, the whodunit aspect of these movies is always fun, especially driven once more by Williamson's snappy dialogue, with movie remake rules being the big topic of conversation, especially explained by the aforementioned Robbie and Charlie. And for the most part, the mix of witty dialogue and fast-paced thrills makes this another frequently engaging entry in the series. Now, there were some very slight pacing issues here and there, mainly towards the middle of the movie, maybe like a few scenes go on for just a tad too long, but honestly, it's still solid for the most part. Which leads to the final reveal that goes back to it being two killers, after the third movie only had one killer. When it comes to who the killers were, I really liked one and did not care at all for the other. The one I didn't like was Charlie. As I mentioned, he played one of the new iterations of Randy, being a movie fanatic that explains the rules of remakes, which I think is a way of throwing suspicion off of him. But he really only has like one or two scenes I'd call well done. Otherwise, he's a pretty bland, boring character who really doesn't get a whole lot to do for much of the film. I mean, he and Robbie are asked by Gale to help out, but he always felt like he was just there. Most of his dialogue isn't quite as witty or as memorable as the other characters, and I think of the two pseudo Randy Meeks characters, Robbie was the funnier of the two, and the only other interesting scene he has prior to his big reveal is this moment played for laughs where he and Kirby are having a moment alone, and then they're comically interrupted by one of the other characters. And while not every killer reveal is one that I'm head over heels for, I just felt absolutely nothing with this particular one. I had no issue with his intentions where he wants to continue on as being the new Randy, but everything leading up to that, he had only, like I said, one or two decent moments, and otherwise, that's it. There's nothing emotionally impactful about his reveal to me, because he's a character that we were never built up to care that much about. And plus, he's killed off almost as quickly as he's revealed. Like, I had issues with the reveal of Mickey in Scream 2, and even that I thought was a little better done, as at least he felt like he made more of an impact in the short time that we saw him than Charlie does. So that was disappointing. But the other big reveal is that Sidney's cousin Jill, played by Emma Roberts, who's built up to be one of the central focuses of the entire movie, is actually one of the killers. And she's doing this as a whole big revenge plot against Sidney because she's jealous of the fame she got from the events of the other movies. And that was fantastic. While this does channel a little bit of the same energy as Roman from Scream 3, what makes Jill an even better reveal is just how much more cunning she winds up being. Not only does she take out Charlie and pin him as one of the killers, similar to what Mrs. Loomis did to Mickey in Scream 2, but she also engages in a cover-up that is absolutely one of the best sequences in any Scream film. The sequence in which she beats the crap out of herself to make her look like one of the victims is on par with Billy and Stu stabbing each other in the first movie, if not an even better moment, especially thanks to a great performance by Emma Roberts. And when it's revealed Sidney survives Jill's initial attack, it especially leads to a great showdown in the hospital, which ends the film on an electrifying note.
Clear. Clear?
Clear.
The only other thing I wanted to bring up, which was a major point of criticism for this movie, is the visual style. The way this looks, it's very reminiscent of an Instagram filter, with a lot of scenes looking overexposed and with a glare to all the daytime sequences. I don't know why this was done other than to maybe lean into that social media feel. I get how this comes off as a little distracting for people, as it gives the film a bit of this Lifetime Hallmark look, but I'll be honest, I don't hate it like everyone else does. That's not the biggest strike against this movie. It's definitely distracting in some sequences, but for me personally, it's one of those things that after a few times, I got used to it. I think more than anything, that'll be the one element that'll come down mostly to personal preference. For some, the style is so distracting that it takes away from being immersed in the story, but for me, while it didn't look the greatest, because I enjoyed the story that much, it wasn't the end of the world. Scream 4 is a solid final film from Wes Craven and a return to form for the franchise after the mixed bag that was Scream 3. While by no means itself perfect, with some slight pacing issues and one of the killers being underwhelming, it's once again a very clever, meta, self-referential film that brings us a nice mix of thrills and laughter, bringing back the spirit of what made those first two movies so great. I find it very underrated, and I had an absolute blast. Scream 4 gets an 8 out of 10. So stay tuned, as up next will be my review of the newest film, Scream 2022. And in the meantime, let me know, did you see Scream 4, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did you think this is one of the better Scream movies, one of the worst Scream movies? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it. And for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.